Hey everyone, my name is Angela Lynn.
And I'm Jesse Lynn, and welcome back to another episode of But Where Are You Really From? This week, we wanted to dive into the fantasy section of our topics and talk about video games. I think both of us played video games to some degree growing up, but I definitely have played it. Maybe a ton more video games than you have
Yes.
as an adult. And I think video games are a really interesting reflection of how society thinks of escape because they represent like a really interesting, immersive kind of way to get away from reality. And so, one of the questions that we were mulling over is why isn't there more representation of Asian Americans in AAA video games? And should there be more representation of Asian Americans in AAA video games? And I think the argument can be made for or against whether or not representation matters in a video game. I think largely based off of what the content of the video games are, right?
Yeah, I kind of agree. It's dicey. I mean, it's the same kind of topics in some ways as TV and movies, but I guess the difference is that there's so much reality or realistic portrayal in TV and movies that the idea of authentic representation, I think, comes up more in those topics because fantasy, I think, is a lot of what we're going to talk about today in terms of like the gray area of whether something should or should not be like totally true to some sort of like racial or cultural authentic background. But I still kind of feel like if it's supposed to represent a realistic world based on like realistic people, there's a degree of like, should this not look more like what it is in real life? That's kind of, for me, that's where the line is drawn versus like elves and like, it's just like the full fantasy world. Then it's kind of like, I don't know, does this matter? But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could jump right into it. One of the examples that we had was the Witcher spinoff, I believe it's called Blood Origin. So it had a pretty, I want to say, pretty diverse cast. And obviously, we love to root for Asian American actors. And Michelle Yeoh was in it as this, like, very solitary, last of her line elf. And it was really cool because I think they really made use of her, like, martial arts skill set. And, like, so she really did kind of a great job shining there, but it falls into this kind of like weird in between area that you're talking about, which is that it is fully fantasy because the Witcher environment is fantasy, but it's fantasy based in some like European medieval setting, right? So, like, the Witcher books were originally written by, I believe, a Polish author. So, there's a lot of kind of influences around that are European or Eastern European. When Michelle landed that role, there's always, or any roles like that, there's always this kind of interchange of whether or not an Asian appearing person exists in the overall world that's been constructed by the original author. And I think this is like a really interesting space because it is, like I said, it's fantasy, but there's some elements of reality that it borrows from. It's not like totally like we're in space or like some kind of weird Candyland situation. My perspective is obviously I love keeping her there, but I do think it is a little bit weird sometimes when folks throw characters of different backgrounds into a mixed ensemble cast and then don't really explore those backgrounds very much. So, like, there was some backstory around, what'd you say, like clan, like the elven clan that she was a part of, but they didn't really go into it. So, like, it wasn't a fully fleshed out fantasy for me. So you just kind of had like her cutting through things looking really badass and like, her usual zhuzh, which I love, but I was also kind of just like, what's the real story here and like what's the motivation?
I kind of am ambivalent a little bit because the idea of elves or things that are like completely fantastical, I'm like, I get both sides of the argument, I guess. I'm like, if you're like very to the book of like, well, the origin of elves in like mythology has like a European background. So the way that they've always envisioned elves or depicted them is like more European or Nordic, even, or whatever, right? So then, in that sense, she doesn't fit the bill. On the other hand, these are mythical creatures. So it's kind of like, let's be real. If they were real, they wouldn't look like any of us. They wouldn't look like any race. They would just look like fucking monsters. Once again, like the only area where I'm kind of like, it does matter a little bit is if it veers into realism a little like more than this. So if you guys have been following, there was controversy recently with Ubisoft's new, well, it's not that new, I guess, by the time you're listening to this, but Assassin's Creed Shadows, which is the latest in that franchise, which, if you know Ubisoft, Assassin's Creed is like their largest cash cow. It's like the biggest franchise they have, the one with the most eyeballs on it. And this one is set in Japan, feudal Japan, so the time of samurais and ninjas and all that. And the controversy is that you can play one of two protagonists, and one of them is a female Japanese ninja. But if you wanted to play a male, it is a black samurai whose name is Yasuke, and supposedly was based on a real historical figure that existed in history somewhere. And there's a lot of controversy around this for many different reasons. There's some like very legitimate controversy, I think, that has nothing to do with Yasuke at all, which is like Japanese people are frankly kind of offended by a lot of the things in the game because it doesn't accurately portray Japan. They're just like pointing out all these things are like you were too lazy to distinguish the difference between like an old time Chinese versus old time Japanese if you're trying to portray Japan realistically. And I guess the controversy around that is like it's been known as a franchise that's supposed to deal with historical events and places like fairly accurately. So, with that kind of in mind, I think the Japanese controversy is very grounded in something because if their whole thing is like we accurately depict shit, it seems like there are many ways in which they did not. Okay, so then the Yasuke part is like, why did you cast a black samurai if this thing is like set in Japan? Like, is there really a need to like, even if he was a real person, like, what is the point of finding like one person in history that is like not the normal one and making it this big deal? I think that's a lot of the rub around it is also like, again, you're trying to like immerse in this world. And yes, people are saying like, oh, you're just forgetting that the female character is Japanese. Both used to be both, you know, like it both used to be the of the land. So this is just like the first time they're veering from it. And I guess the question is like, why? Like, why was there a need to do this? And is it like coming from a genuine place of this is like such an interesting story and like such an important story, and also probably from a marketing standpoint like helps us stand out from other Japanese setting things, but I'm like this feels a little inauthentic to me. And also, if anything, from an authenticity standpoint, right, makes it feel like, okay, yet again, you're telling me that like an Asian person can't be the star of the show of a game set in Asia. Like, are you kidding me? So that was the biggest, like, for me, slap in the face. It's just kind of like, bro, you got to take like the most extreme thing to make a justification for replacing Asians again in a place that is set in Asia. So that's my whole rub with all that.
It almost, in a way, feels like tokenization because they've selected this very singular individual. Even if it was a real story, like there are tons of exceptional, very interesting like lore and mythology from Japan. So it's like, why pick this single thing? It's funny because I wanted to go back because I was like, I was talking about the Witcher thing. I was thinking about like, what would happen if someone in like mainland China did like a mythology TV show and cast everyone as Americans? Like that would be really weird. Then I thought about it more and I was like, well, a lot of these things, kind of to what you're saying, are so fantastical. I started playing this game called Black Myth Wukong, and it's like Shen Wukong's story. And there are these like fantastical characters in it, but they don't look like anything. And obviously, like the theming is Asian because we can tell, but you could literally have anyone play that character because it is literally like a monster that doesn't look anything like a person. So yeah, I do think like as it gets, as you mentioned, as it gets closer to like reality where it is like a mimic of a story that happened before or is the history of somewhere in the past, I definitely feel like the sensitivities around that are just much higher. And part of it is like escape, right? Like, I think if you're playing a game and you know the subject matter very well and you notice all of these things, it's annoying because you can't escape. You're like, well, what's that? Like, that looks so bizarre. Like, it wouldn't be like that in that particular space or in that scenario. So
You've heard me complain about how weird it is to be an American born Mandarin speaker because I grew up speaking Mandarin at home and have a passing native accent, but simultaneously sound like a child when trying to talk about real things. Since I realized no one out there was catering to people like us and decided I'm just going to do it myself, I teamed up with my native Taiwanese Mandarin language teacher to create Real You Mandarin, a self-paced online Mandarin course built specifically for ABCs and ABTs. All of our content is video-based, realistic dialogues centered on topics you'd actually want to talk about, from dating and pop culture to media representation and growing up as a minority in a majority society. You'll learn the relevant vocabulary in the context you actually use them and be able to practice them daily with pre-built digital flashcards. You'll also be able to practice speaking by shadowing, repeating back, or following along with all of these dialogues to practice speaking at natural speed with the right pronunciations. Check out the course at realumandarin.com and get 10% off using promo code WhereAreYouFrom10. Let us help you express the real you when you speak Mandarin. Hey listeners, wondering how you can support us? The biggest way is by increasing our visibility by following us on Instagram at WhereAreYouFromPod, on TikTok at But Where Are You Really From, subscribing to our YouTube channel under But Where Are You Really From Podcast, rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, and telling your friends. The more people we can get to listen to the show, the more we can continue spotlighting different perspectives and stories. And if you feel so inclined, we're also accepting donations at buymeacoffee.com/whereareyoufrom. Thanks y'all. On the flip side, something that is totally fiction, but is like, I think a literally like more realistic way in some aspects of imagining what a foreigner in Japan's experience would be like in feudal Japan was Shogun, the recent FX show that had a white dude who came as like a missionary or quote unquote missionary to Japan. And I don't know, there's just like a lot of mystery around Yasuke's story and the Ubisoft thing. Like, we don't know how he was treated when he first came, but like the way they're portraying him is obviously like he's like this amazing samurai now that's well respected and like the same as a Japanese like lords and stuff. And it's like, nah, Shogun was really good at like showing the honestly racism the Japanese people had towards the foreigner, because it's like, you ain't one of us. Like, you're this like random outsider who's like barbaric coming into our country. And that's more how I imagine that would have been like back in that day, even if he did gain trust and eventually rise up. Like, I don't imagine it would have been just this like, oh, you're just as respected and like highly honorable as these like just ancestral like father to son lineage way that Japan has worked forever. So
I kind of feel like games are like really good jokes. Like, it can be very offensive, but if it's a great joke, people are like, fine, I loved it. And I think part of the issue is just like when the game storytelling or experience is not good, it becomes so hard to defend that piece of work when there are all these like other glaring things that like impact your experience of that particular game. Well, I was just talking about Black Myth Wukong and I just started it, but I thought it's been pretty good so far. Like, when I first started the game, everything was in English because I was like, oh, I'm English. But then I was like watching the cutscenes and I was like, the mouths don't match up to the English. And I was like, oh, yes, this is a Mandarin game. I need to change it to Mandarin and use English subtitles. So I was like, okay, really, like, I'm super in it. All the dialogue is in Mandarin. But I think it's like, I think it just shows like great material and great storytelling where you're like so sucked in, helps to buffer against these kinds of things, because when you're like so absorbed into the material, I feel like you just don't necessarily notice certain inaccuracies or like small things like you were saying with the chopsticks. Like, I feel like it's when the story is just not good and people are like, oh, I don't like that, I don't like that, I don't like this.
so I agree with you. Like, the storytelling is so important to make people care or not care about certain things like this. So like a totally different example is like Last of Us is highly regarded as like one of the best storytelling that has ever existed in the industry. And for example, like I'm sure some people still meh, meh about it, but like Ellie's a lesbian and no one cares. Even like I feel like I didn't hear any like huge hubbub from like anti-LGBT or whatever being like, I'm not gonna play this game because this girl is gay. But because like this fucking story is amazing, so who cares? So there's just like a part of that where it's like, yeah, very strong story allows for from good or bad side, like more representation, whether it's like authentic or not, because it's not the center of the story. Wait, so tell people more about Wukong. So first of all, not everyone knows that legend, so maybe you can explain a little bit.
Honestly, I'm gonna be bad Asian here, and all I remember is that it's a monkey that has magical powers, and that he was like
He is a
gifted.
monkey king, sir.
He was gifted his powers from Guanyin Fusha, I think, and then at some point, like the powers were revoked because he was being really naughty, and then I think he goes on like an adventure to regain his powers.
Yeah, I think that's a that's a good synopsis. And so the game is loosely based on him, but not fully that because you said there's a retelling or something.
I haven't gotten through all of it yet, but like the first scene is like super epic. So you just have him fighting like you know when you go to the temple and you see those like statues of the gods, but they are like, the face is blacked out or it's like green. So he's like fighting they're like huge. You see at the temple and you're like, oh, this is like what a cute little like statue. And then you see it in the game and you're like, oh, that's like maybe what people had in mind originally, where it's like an enormous like huge person. And then he kind of gets like smacked down because obviously there's like three of them. And then there's also like a demigod that you're fighting. And then the story pivots to like another monkey individual. And I'm not quite sure where it goes, but I believe what is happening is like the monkey individual is searching for all of Sun Wukong's raiments, like his belongings, and to like regather his essence or his power or something like that.
So this game, everyone is non-human. So there's no like explicit authenticity, right? In this sense, like it's like a monkey
I
looking
mean, there are
man.
human
Then
figures.
okay,
Like the one of the demigods that you fight looks like a human, but like so far, all of the characters have been like fantastical gods. They even have this like a little like 2D like gnome god
cute.
thing that helps you, and then the monkeys. So I haven't seen. And humanoid wolves.
Oh,
I don't recall that as part of
but
the.
are they Asian? Just kidding. I mean, it is a
I
real
mean,
question.
I don't know what an Asian wolf looks like. I guess.
Well, I guess because the question at the beginning of this is like, should elves be Asian? So I'm curious about if this is all like monsters or like fantastical things. Did they try to make them look quote unquote Asian, or they're just like monsters? They're just like creatures.
I think they just look like monsters. They look like creatures, and then like the 2D gong looks like a gnome kind of thing,
Hmm.
but it's textured in a way where it's almost like a tree. So you're like, there's no ethnicity necessarily to how he looks. And then the version of Sun Wukong you're playing the monkey. I mean, I guess you could say like the facial features maybe a little bit, but like again, it's a monkey, so like I don't really know.
The flip side, kind of contrasting with Assassin's Creed Shadows, the cultural aspect, like of the storytelling and representation of the surroundings, feels a lot more authentic, right? About it is that it kind of makes the game a vehicle to get people interested, right, in potentially learning more about the legend, the culture, and all that.
Yeah, agreed. Well, on that note, listeners, we hope you enjoyed the topic of this episode. We hope you enjoy playing video games. Let us know what video games you enjoy playing. But we all would like to, in particularly, know if there's anything you played recently that has a really well driven story. We'd love to hear what that game is. Feel free to shout out to us on the socials, DM us, let us know.
And come back next week because we will have another fresh episode for you then. And until then, 再见,
再见,
bitches.
bitches.